So let's start with the precursors of this event, starting with the offender, known as Peter Demeter. So Peter Demeter was financially motivated to have his wife Christine killed to inherit a $1 million fund, which was some sort of insurance fund. What really happened here was Peter plotted and hired a hitman to have his wife killed. The victim, of course, being Peter's wife Christine, was found bludgeoned next to her Cadillac in the garage. She most definitely trusted her husband, as they didn't really seem to be that bad of a couple. They were happily married, they had the daughter, of course, so everything seemed pretty normal and nonchalant. For the public aspect of these precursors, Peter was labeled as a well-known and popular person in his area. He was very good at his job and very successful as well. He had a good house, a nice family, and just seemed like an average person. Looking back into this sort of criminology perspective, Peter was really avoiding any sort of deterrence or public attention as he hired the hitman to do it for him. So now let's focus more into the actual transaction of this event. So the transaction, if you guys do not know, is pretty much the actual event happening. So for this case, it'd be the murder of his wife. On a sunny day on July 18th, 1973, in Mississauga, Ontario, Christine Demeter was found murdered and bludgeoned in her own garage of her house. So focusing back onto those three main things, so the offender, the victim, and the public aspect for the transaction. So Peter, the offender, was obviously out in Toronto for this, and when he did this, he hired the hitman to come into his own house and have the wife murdered. The victim, of course, being Christine, was found in her garage, bludgeoned with her head bashed into a car. This was a very gruesome and hateful crime, as the hitman was definitely directed in some sort of direction on how to kill her, as Peter had no remorse in doing any sort of actions to her. Let it also be known that there was no murder weapon found at the crime scene. So from that public aspect now, Peter returned home and was with guests as he was shopping in Toronto, right? So when he got home, everything was very new to him. He was very shook. He was very sad. And what he went on to do was ask for reward money and always was looking to find that sort of killer, even though he planned it all along. Additionally, the daughter, known as Andrea, was found in the living room, unharmed, untouched, safe, during the murder of Christine. We'll now analyze the aftermath of the crime. So the aftermath comes after the transaction, and essentially what it is consequences and just steps taken forward after the murder. Starting with the offender, Peter was never really labeled innocent nor guilty in this sort of tragic event. So although he wasn't really proven his guilt in court in any way, there was an 11-week trial, which is one of the longest in Canada's history, if I may add, and eventually he was sentenced to a jail sentence in 1974 for plotting the murder of his wife, Christine. The $1 million insurance fund bond was never actually collected. So in reality, this whole event and this whole plan for Peter to collect this money was a bust. Peter never actually confessed to any sort of crime, and he did it with no remorse whatsoever. So there's two sort of victims in this aftermath, I would say, and that would be, first of all, Christine, who was murdered, the wife, and the daughter, Andrea. Focusing first on Christine, Christine was obviously murdered, so there goes her life. She was pronounced dead. But more focusing on the daughter now, the daughter went on to develop huge PTSD later on in life, as the father kept threatening her and keeping in contact with her, and that really made her push her limits, as it was a very hard thing to go through as she had no mom growing up. Additionally, Andrea was taken into custody by her cousin, Stephen, and she was kept there safe and had a nice childhood. So now focusing on that public aftermath aspect of this thing, so that kind of correlates into law enforcement and just public consequences. This was one of the longest trials in Canada's history, as it was a very diverse and just very sophisticated matter. He was charged and convicted with several counts of murder, kidnapping, and arson throughout his whole life, and was even denied parole at the age of 85. Briefly, psychopaths have a very huge lack of moral development, specifically in their frontal cortex, and this allows them to not feel any sort of remorse or guilt for their actions. Peter never hesitated to commit any sort of devious act, whether that be having his wife murdered, threatening people's lives, and kidnapping. On top of all these devious acts committed by Peter, he's able to successfully and without any remorse look in the mirror and be satisfied with himself. Peter always thought that he was correct and always the best person in the room, which really enlightens the fact that he has a very high sense of self-worth. As mentioned several times, Peter was never able to confess or even admit to any sort of wrongdoings in his whole life, which really shows the fact that he's unable to accept responsibility for his own actions.